talking and take questions. Stefano, you're
Yeah.
going to moderate.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for the speech, the presentation. I think was really inspiring to see how to turn uncertainty upside down and to tackle it. We collected some questions. I will pose just 3 of them because of the sake of time. But let me start with the first one, which is how can I manage uncertainty considering the responsibility of my behaviors, actions on other people, environment that are around me? And what about the negative externalities? So it's a little bit more cultural, so how we influence with our taking uncertainty the other people that are around and the environment.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And one thing is that there's empirical research that shows that whether you realize it or not, the emotional state of top leaders trickles down into the organization. So if you are feeling a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, then that will trickle down into the organization. So the first thing I would do is encourage you to, and this is why we talk about this to you at a personal level first, to take the time to go through these tools and comfort yourself and to see uncertainty differently. And then the second thing I would do is to, again, reframe for your organization. If there's one thing I'd say, reframe for your organization what this uncertainty means. I'll give you, COVID was a great example of this. I saw leaders handle this very poorly and some handle this really well. And the ones who handle it well, number one, they express empathy for people and for the distress they must feel. And number two, they reframed it. That instead of talking about this terrible loss and how everything's going wrong, they framed it as this is an opportunity for us to band together, to help each other. We will get through this. We will discover new ways to go forward into the future. That's just reframing it from, there's absolutely loss that we've all experienced, but they're reframing it in terms of the opportunity. And the great leaders that went through COVID, they said, look at what we've been able to achieve. Look at how we were able to help customers. Look, but they also express empathy. Okay, second question.
Yeah, thank you. And the second one is kind of related to this first one, but I want to ask you, and the audience want to know a little bit more on how can large organizations and corporations try to engage many and potentially all the employees in reframing, because the view that you're proposing, it seems a little bit more at the individual level. So how has, as part of the organization, should embrace uncertainty, and then we will have an impact on the organization, but what the other way around? So how can organization, large corporation, engage many people into it?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's something, so here's the thing. Large organizations for many decades have been able to get away with basically doing the same thing over and over. As uncertainty increases, more and more we're feeling that the tools we have are not enough. And so my thesis is that organizations will need to help train people so that they can also face uncertainty well. That developing, let's call it resilience. I like to think of this as beyond resilience, because resilience to me is like you take a punch and you stay standing, whereas this is about, we could call it transilience. How do I take uncertainty and turn it into something good? So we can teach this, we can encourage it, but there are not many large organizations who have already done this. There are some exceptions. So for example, the luxury group LVMH, one of their 8 things they hire for is the ability, they call it ambiguity tolerance, uncertainty tolerance. They actually hire and train for that. But there aren't many organizations that do that. So number one thing we can do is we can model it as a leader, so that reframing. And the second thing we can do is, and this is the same for innovation, by the way, is build broad, like a common language. So kind of a broad effort to educate people that it is possible to face uncertainty better, and there are tools out there, and the number one thing we can do is reframe it as a source of loss to a source of opportunity. And so it's kind of broad educational effort to create a common language about who are we and how do we face uncertainty. Now, in the book, I talk about tools like your uncertainty manifesto, your story. There's a lot of other reframing tools that can help you do that. And so organizations that do that well, like remember I told you about the CEO of this big fashion group. He said, I want your favorite color to be gray, because gray can be any color. It has more strength than any color. And so that's who we are. We're capable of facing any uncertainty and turning it into a possibility. So he's shaping their identity around that even. So it was kind of a brilliant example. So to summarize, again, what did I say? I said, number one, demonstrate it as a leader. And demonstrate what? Number one, reframing it. Number two, build broad understanding that it is possible to face uncertainty. And one of the tools to do that is reframing. And number three, I would reinforce it with some of the other tools we talk about in the book, like what's the story, what's the uncertainty manifesto, what's the identity around, and that will kind of spread through the organization over time.
Let me go for the last question, and thanks also for this deep answer. And I go a little bit forward. So you were talking about a lot of CEO, a lot of inspiring people coming up with this manage of uncertainty. And our audience asked, what if I'm inclined to take leap, but the organizational culture is against it? How can I convince my superior, so our referent within the organization, to be more relaxed in the uncertainty? So what if I'm in the middle, stuck in the middle, let's say?
That's actually a very common thing. It's a hard thing to deal with. So number one, I would acknowledge it's a challenge, right? The number one thing I would say, and this comes from some of my other work, the Innovators Method, but also actually it's in the do section. How do you take action? How do you transform that thing into an experiment? And why do I say that? Because number one, it lets you take a small step. And number two, it allows you to get some data. And, people who are afraid are, convinced by data and evidence. So I often talk about, you want to be, if you're like an innovative lead, you want to do something new, you want to do some new possibility. How do you lead with data rather than with vision? Often we want to go out and sell a grand vision and get a big budget and all that. And the danger of that is, number one, it might not work. And number two, people have high expectations. Versus if you can run a tiny experiment and show that it works and get permission to run the next experiment and then the next experiment. And I'll give you a very quick example. Bosch, big European company, CEO says, we're going to put artificial intelligence in everything. Nice vision, but what the heck? How do we do that? The CEO hires this gentleman, Rahul Kapoor, and says, I want to put you in charge of it, but you don't have many resources. So how does he he's got some top level support, but everybody else is skeptical. How does he get people to believe? What he said is, I looked for 3 projects that were absolutely doable, really small incremental applications of artificial intelligence, but where I knew we could create really measurable value. And then I needed only one of those 3 to succeed. And then I could tell the story of that success. And it was a very simple application. It was basically assembly line, parts going by. If the camera takes a photo and it looks like there's a fault, then somebody inspects it. All they did is create a little learning loop and said, hey, a person inspected this. Was the photo accurate or not, in kicking it off to a human being? And they were able to radically reduce the amount of things that needed to be inspected, the amount of parts that needed to be inspected, and radically reduce the number of parts that actually were faulty but went to the field anyway and had to come back. And so created a ton of value. And now the AI group inside of Bosch is like 150 people, a gargantuan enterprise. But again, tiny experiment, one after the other, convincing them with the data rather than with the vision.
That's super interesting. I think that the experimentation is also a mindset that comes from entrepreneurship and design. So the topic that we were discussing this evening. So thank you so much, Nathan, for the inspiring speech and talk that you had. I know it's an important day today for Americans, so we will leave you go to celebrate Thanksgiving with the family. And thank you so much again for this talk and the discussion that we had together.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please do look me up. And I really would love to get together when we were able to do that. So thank you, everyone.